You are listening to KZSC's Voces Críticas Critical Voices. I am your host, Silvana Falcón. Today I have an interview with Dr. Christine Shearer, a senior researcher at Coalswarm, an organization that is mapping and analyzing all major proposed coal projects on the globe. Dr. Shearer's research focuses on environmental sociology, particularly global energy policy, and climate change adaptation. She previously worked as a postdoctoral scholar in Earth System Science at the University of California at Irvine, as a research fellow at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and as a reporter for the Center for Investigative Reporting. Her academic writing has appeared in science and media publications including Nature, Environmental Research Letters, National Geographic, and the New York Times. She is also the author of Kivalina, a climate change story, published by Haymarket Books in 2011. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of California at Santa Barbara. Welcome, Christine, to KZSC's Voces Críticas.
Thank you.
So tell us about this village of Kivalina. It's located in Alaska, and I would like our listeners to have a better sense of how you came to learn about this community and about the community itself.
Kivalina is in the northwest of Alaska. It's about 80 miles above the Arctic Circle, so very, very far north, very cold. It is a barrier reef island of about 2 square miles of land, and it's located between, on one side, the Chukchi Sea, and on the other by the Kivalina Lagoon. The population is around 400 people who are primarily Inupiat, which is a branch of Inuit or Arctic people. Inuit people that live in Alaska are often referred to as Alaska Native. And I was in an environmental law class, and the professor was reading headlines in the news that were pertinent to the issues we were discussing. And one of them was about this little Alaska Native village that needed to be relocated because of climate change, and how they were suing fossil fuel companies for lying about climate change and for their relocation costs. And so I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I have to write about this. Because at that point, I was aware of just how serious climate change was and how much money and time that fossil fuel companies had spent misleading people about how serious it was.
Now, there are over 200 federally recognized Alaska Native tribes. So tell us about Inupiat people, and how long have they lived in Kivalina, and how do they make their living?
The people of Kivalina are primarily Inupiat, and they trace their ancestry to the Arctic back thousands of years. So we're talking BC, migrating across the Bering Strait from Asia to what is now called Alaska. And what has become Kivalina was originally a seasonal hunting ground, as the Inupiat were nomadic, and they moved with their hunting seasons. What happened was the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia in the late 1800s, and the village of Kivalina was established in the early 1900s. And it was part of the effort, the Western effort to, quote-unquote, modernize indigenous peoples and cultures and make them stationary. And if you talk to the people of Kivalina, they say their parents and their grandparents were basically coerced to settle in Kivalina because they faced legal repercussions if they didn't enroll their children in school. But in exchange for settling there, they got some small-scale infrastructure, they got a school, a medical clinic, some churches, so they began making a home for themselves. And the way they make their living is most of the people there live off of subsistence, which is very much part of their culture, and that's basically, living off the land, hunting, fishing, they do whaling. They're very much self-sufficient. Some of them do work for the city council or for the school. There's a lot of military bases in Alaska, so they'll enlist in the military. And some of them also work for what are called Alaska Native corporations. So to get into a little bit of Alaska history, Alaska was approved as a state in 1958, which just happened to be 1 year after the first major oil discovery there. So as the U.S. government and oil companies were exploring for more oil in Alaska, they were bumping up against the land rights claims of Alaska Natives, who had lived there before the U.S. ever arrived, before Russia, before any of these people, and had never really had the issue of their land and their rights resolved. So eventually in 1971, the U.S. passed a law known as the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And what it did was establish 13 what are called Alaska Native regional corporations, and they have subsurface and mineral rights to the lands they were given, which was 1/9 of Alaska. And Alaska Natives were made shareholders of these corporations. So these corporations have been very much encouraged to engage in and partner with oil and mining companies on extraction, on drilling, on mining, to create profits that can be distributed to Alaska Natives as shareholders. So this has created some tension between Alaska Natives that want Inuit people to maintain the subsistence way of life, which you see a lot of in small communities like Kivalina, versus the leaders of these large Alaska Native corporations that think of the corporations as a way to establish economic development and indigenous independence. So this has been some way that Alaska Natives, work or supplement their income is through these Alaska Native corporations.
And so here you are, this California girl that goes to Kivalina in 2008. And I'd be curious if you could kind of go back to that time and tell us, what did you see? How did it feel to be there? And just give us a sense of also how long you were there. We're sort of fascinated about your journey to Kivalina and sort of entering this community.
It was intimidating because, I'd read this headline and I thought, wow, that's really neat. And I didn't really know how to get there. And so I contacted a lawyer who was working on the case who kind of explained the way that I would travel there, which included taking a cargo plane. And he gave me some numbers of people there to call to kind of work out the arrangements for staying there. And so in calling and talking to them, I had a sense that maybe I could stay somewhere, but I wasn't totally sure. The biggest thing, though, when I got there was I didn't realize just how bad their situation was. I went there knowing that they had to be relocated, but I thought of relocation as this very predictable process, that it was on a timeline. And when I got there, I realized, no, they're actually in danger. They were in danger at the time. They were in danger from large storms. They were in danger of erosion and flooding. And their situation was pretty dire. So it was kind of a wake-up call that, this was 2008, that climate change was happening and it was already having radical effects on this community. They don't have a hotel, so I went there for a week before school started and stayed in the janitor's lounge. And I did have plumbing, and they gave me access to a refrigerator, and I brought my own food because they have one store, but it's very expensive. And as I said, most of the people there live off of subsistence. So it was also one of those moments where I realized, wow, if I had to live off the land, I would just die. I have no idea how to do it. I can't hunt. I don't know where to collect water. So that was interesting as well.
That's very eye-opening, right?
Yes. And it also shows that people that are that in touch, if you have to make your living off of the land, off hunting, off fishing, you're very much in touch with what is happening to the earth. And so they knew, there was no question to them that climate change was happening. They knew, and they had known for decades.
That's an excellent point, because I'm thinking, too, when you're there in the community and you're speaking to people and collecting your data and engaging with them about what's happening in terms of climate change, what kinds of things were you hearing there about their relationship to the land or what was happening to their community?
One of the stories that really stuck out to me was an elder who told me that in the wintertime, before the wintertime, they dig a hole into the ground and they store their meat there because it's so cold there, particularly in the winter, that they can basically use it as a kind of freezer and they can store their meat there. And what they had noticed was that because of global warming, and the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global average, because of the warming temperatures, that they could no longer store their meat for as long, that it would start to melt and it would get rotten. And so this was something they were noticing firsthand. They also talked about how animal migrations were changing, that it was becoming harder to hunt. It was less predictable. They could rely less on their traditional knowledge for these things, more reliable seasons, that these things were changing. And also that the ice was starting to change. It was becoming thinner in places, less reliable, and it was making hunting dangerous because places that they had been able to go to for a long time were now more unknown about and less stable of the ice there. And then a lot of the younger people talked about the storms they were experiencing, the fact that they're being threatened by these large storms, and because of erosion, they have less protection against these storms on their island.
My sense is if you are in a community like Kivalina, where you are seeing on a daily basis the kind of effects of climate change, it's a cross-generational conversation.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it affects them so much, and yet what was also interesting to me going there is how much, they just tried to go about their daily lives. And so it's kind of an interesting tension between climate change is having a radical effect on them, but they very much want to, maintain a sense of just living their lives and doing the other things they need to be doing, making sure kids go to school and trying to maintain their culture is also very important to them, maintaining their language. So it's all these different things going on at once.
You are listening to Dr. Christine Shearer. She is the author of Kivalina, A Climate Change Story, published in 2011 by Haymarket Books. She's also a senior researcher at Coalswarm, an organization that is mapping and analyzing all major proposed coal projects around the globe. Climate change is clearly forcibly displacing this community. And oftentimes when we think about forcible displacement, we connect it to issues of social conflict, political upheaval, etc. Where will this community be in 5 years or in 10 years?
We really don't know. Like I said, I got to Kivalina thinking the relocation would be a stable and predictable process, and I had not heard or read about all the dangerous storms they were experiencing until I got there. And so what's happening in Kivalina is because of the warming, that sea ice is forming later and later in the year on their coastline, and when it forms later, it makes the coastline vulnerable to erosion, because that coastline is no longer frozen solidly in place. And so the village had noticed this change for a while, but really became a danger in 2004 when a large storm hit and took away a big chunk of their already really small island and was threatening people's homes and safety. And what makes their situation particularly dangerous is they don't have an evacuation road. And so the island was hit with storms again in 2005 and again in 2006, taking away more land. And then in 2006, the Army Corps of Engineers released a report saying Kivalina would be lost to erosion in 10 to 15 years, which would be, just 4 years from now by their timeline. But in 2007, the Army Corps started to build a seawall to buy them some time on the erosion, but it does not protect against flooding, which remains a concern. And actually, a superstorm hit them in 2011 and nearly toppled their seawall. And that would have been an absolute disaster, because they don't have an evacuation road. So I think it's important when we talk about climate change, we realize how much of this, it's not predictable. What we are doing is we're upping the risk, we're upping our chances that people, particularly vulnerable populations that live off the land or do not have the means to move out of harm's way or want to move as a community as Kivalina does, that they will be subject to greater risks and more disasters. But the hope is that a big storm doesn't come and put their lives in danger, and then that the process for relocation will move forward. But it's been very stuck for a long time, and with Trump as president, I'm not terribly optimistic that it's going to move forward much in the next couple years.
So have any members been able to relocate, and if so, relocated to where?
Yeah, so if they relocate, they would do it on their own, and it would likely be to a place, that's already like a larger city. And so only a few people have done that because, by and large, the village of Kivalina want to move together as a community, and they're really pushing for that.
And I understand there is no federal policy in place to deal with this climate change reality. So are there no federal resources available at this point to help with the relocation? Is it really on them to get the resources together to do this move?
Yeah, exactly. There's no federal relocation policy. So what Kivalina has been doing is approaching this very piecemeal, trying to work with several different government agencies and try to secure different grants, different funding streams to basically put together their own relocation. And it is very difficult. And the result is they voted to relocate in 1992. So we're talking 25 years later, and it has not moved forward much at all. Obama did tour Alaska near the end of his presidency, surveying the impacts of climate change. And part of that, he flew over Kivalina because Air Force One is far too large to land there. And then afterwards, he did appoint an agency to act as a central relocation coordinator for Alaska Natives because there was no agency in charge of helping a community relocate. And that was the Denali Commission, which is in Alaska. But the Trump administration has moved to dismantle climate adaptation programs, including the Denali Commission. And there's been a very outspoken person at the Interior Department that maybe people have heard of, Joel Clement, who's talked a lot about Alaska Natives that are in danger from climate change. And he's saying the department had been working toward trying to come up with a budget to help Alaska Native communities relocate, the ones that need to, but that is now ground to a halt. And actually, he was transferred from working on that to now he collects royalties for the oil and gas industry on behalf of the government. So it very much seemed like a message, telling him to shut up about it and that this is not a priority of this administration.
But now you are obviously someone who has studied the effects of climate change. You've seen it up close in the case of Kivalina. And now we are with a current administration that has a number of climate change skeptics. What's your message, maybe not necessarily to the administration, but maybe to other people in the population that are also climate change skeptics?
Yes, when I was in Kivalina, I was talking to some of the people there, and I said how many Americans doubted that climate change was happening. And this one resident, David Frankson, he looked at me and he said, your people say global warming's not happening because they don't live our lives, they don't see our snow, our ice, how it's melting. And so I think about that a lot. Of course, so David would say, it's happening. Come here and see how it's happening, how things are changing. And, this was 2008, so it's funny because in 2008, and I don't know if many people remember this, but I do because I was thinking about climate change all of the time. And the message very much then was that climate change is not happening, which is why I took an interest in Kivalina, because there were all these government reports saying, yes, it's happening and the village needs to be relocated because of climate change. But now I think, it's getting harder and harder to deny that the climate is changing, that things seem to be off, that we're having more unprecedented weather events. 2014, 2015, 2016 were each the hottest years on record. It's getting harder to deny. And all of a sudden now we're hearing, well, okay, yeah, the climate's changing, but it's natural. The climate always changes. So it's funny how, how the denial has changed over time. And now it's happening, but it's natural. So what I would say, Yale does these great studies where they survey the U.S. population to see where they're at on climate change. And there's about a tenth of the population that's just outright dismissive. They say it's not happening, it's not connected to human activity. And I'm not really sure how or if we can reach those people, but there's another 40% that's doubtful. And I think those are the people that we can and we absolutely need to reach. You hear a lot about how 97% of scientists agree that climate change is A, occurring, and B, linked to human activities. But actually what that means is if you take a subset of all the studies related to climate change and you look at them, 97% of them uphold the consensus that it's happening and it's us. 2% of them don't say either way, so they're not counted as part of the consensus. And only 1% say, no, it's, climate change is not happening. And actually a recent study looked at a subset of those 1% of studies and found that every single one had a flaw that when you corrected it, put it in line with the consensus that climate change is happening and it's us. And so the fact is there's been a well-funded campaign to deny the science. And I mean, really, what's more likely that nearly all the world's climate scientists have gone in on this grand hoax in the hopes of getting, puny government research funds. I don't think people realize how much time and effort it takes to get a research grant, and then that the money goes towards research. It's not for profit. Or that, highly profitable fossil fuel corporations have funded some scientists and think tanks to try to convince us that the science is out, taking a cue from the tobacco playbook. Because in the words of one tobacco executive, doubt is our product. And sowing doubt is just a well-established playbook for fighting off regulations and liability.
Yes, science is real, people. You're listening to Dr. Christine Shearer. She's the author of Kivalina, A Climate Change Story, published in 2011 by Haymarket Books. She's also a senior researcher at Coalswarm, an organization that is mapping and analyzing all major proposed coal projects around the globe. So let's talk about this lawsuit that the village of Kivalina filed in 2008 against 24 fossil fuel companies. Tell us which corporations were named in the lawsuit and how the idea of the lawsuit even came to be.
The lawsuit targeted 24 oil, coal, and power companies who were considered significant contributors to climate change, saying their emissions have constituted a public nuisance under law to Kivalina, which is unreasonable harm. And the suit was seeking damages for Kivalina, which is their relocation costs due to climate change, which has been estimated at $100 to $400 million. And it also charged a smaller subset with conspiracy and concerted action for creating a false debate around climate change science. And so those companies that were charged with conspiracy and concerted action were Exxon, BP, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, the coal mining company Peabody, and the power companies AEP, Duke, and Southern Company. the argument there is that they went above and beyond other companies and really funding think tanks and researchers to confuse people about climate change. So the people of Kivalina had voted to relocate in 1992, but when they went to look for help, they realized there's no government agency responsible for relocation, and so they were stuck, essentially. And then meanwhile, they were also facing pollution of their drinking water by the Red Dog mine, which is upstream of them. So they attended a conference on indigenous environmental law in Kotzebue, which is a cargo plane right away from Kivalina. And there they met an environmental justice lawyer named Luke Cole. And so in case people don't know, environmental justice refers to the concentration of hazardous activities like coal plants, oil refineries, waste sites. We've seen a lot of this with the flooding in Houston recently, near communities of color, near poor communities, which are seen as kind of passive least resistance for located, what are called locally unwanted land uses. And so Luke was a lawyer who represented these communities against companies that were polluting them, that were making, creating health problems for them. And so Luke worked with Kivalina to try and address their water pollution issue. And so in doing that, he would travel to Kivalina and then became aware of their problems with erosion and their need to relocate. And so he decided to launch this lawsuit, and he got together with Alaska Native lawyers, and he also got together with some tobacco lawyers, who had either been on the side of tobacco or had been fighting tobacco. He got it from both sides. And the idea was that even if the lawsuit was not successful, it would at least try to hold these companies accountable for their actions in lying to people about climate change, and also get some much-needed attention to Kivalina, who at that point had been largely ignored in the media and, by different government agencies. And I think in that it was very successful and may have even gotten the ball rolling on things like the recent Exxon New movement, which is really targeting Exxon for the millions it spent misleading people on climate change, while its own company documents show that not only did they know that climate change, was occurring, but they were doing their own fairly sophisticated research on it. And I just want to give a little memorial to Luke because he died 1 year after the lawsuit was filed in a car crash in 2009, which was a huge loss because he helped a lot of communities like Kivalina.
So I understand that the lawsuit was dismissed a few years ago. Is that correct?
Yes.
So does the community at this point have any other legal recourse available to them?
So the lawsuit was filed at the federal level, so they could refile it at the state level. They have not done so, and I think that's partly because of all the uncertainty around a lawsuit. It takes a long time. It's a long process. It's really uncertain. It really depends on the judges, and the rulings can later be overturned. I don't know if they would refile it at the state level, but you never know because more and more information is coming out about what fossil companies knew and when. And that's part of the legal discovery process, that as more of these lawsuits are filed and get into legal discovery, that more internal company documents will come out.
Well, thank you so much, Christine, for coming on the air with Voces Críticas today.
Well, thank you.